Water had reached his collar by the time he stopped fighting the rope, not from surrender. He had never surrendered in 47 years. He stopped because the rope was the same grade his own crew used on debtors who needed persuading, tied with the same efficiency, and the ocean was faster than any argument he had left. The car was tilted nose down, pressing him back against the headrest, and cold came in through every seam. Above the windshield, the dock lights blurred and shrank. His uncles would already be walking away. Kim Moo-yuk had spent 30 years as the answer to every problem the Cheon family brought him. Not with boardroom speeches, with visits at night, with arrangements that left difficult people cooperative by morning, with a competence so complete and so unrewarded that he had eventually stopped expecting recognition and simply continued. The family's lone empire ran on his work. Its problems vanished because of his work, and his uncles, who had borrowed from that empire, spent it carelessly, and contributed nothing to its survival, had calculated that they could not afford to share what remained of it. So they had called him with a late job. An urgent borrower who needed handling. He had gone, as he always went, without suspicion. The rope had come from behind. He had thought he understood their motive. Greed. Simple men, simple reason. He was right about the greed. He was wrong about where the story ended. He would not discover that until much later, until a prison cell and a shaking old man and a name he should have known years earlier. But he carried that wrongness into the dark with him, not knowing it was there. The water covered his face. A 50-year-old body holds its breath as long as it can, and then it stops. Nothing, everything, all at once. 3 decades of memory laid out like a house he knew in the dark, every room exactly where he had left it. His hands were in front of him, smooth skin, clean knuckles without their old scars. He sat up. The sea in front of him was the same sea. The sky was the same sky. The difference was the light. Morning in 1990, not night in the year he had died in. And the snack cart that a woman named Mrs. Chun parked at the top of the beach path every morning. A cart that had not existed for 25 years. He knew this beach. He had sat on it as a boy. He was sitting on it again now, in a body that fit 17 and not 47. And before he did anything else, his mind went to one place. His grandmother was going to collapse from a cardiac event in approximately 6 weeks. He stood. He knew the date without checking. The particular slant of the summer light and the smell of the air told him exactly. He had lived this day once, and he was living it again. And the only thing that mattered right now was getting to a hospital before the 6th week came. 3 boys came down the path before he reached the road. Older than him, loose and aimless, the kind who moved in groups because it was the only way they felt solid. Their leader had a chain on his belt loop. He said something about Moo-yuk's shoes and then, when that produced nothing, put a hand into Moo-yuk's shoulder. Moo-yuk looked at the hand. He looked at the boy's face. He had 47 years in his memory and 6 weeks before his grandmother's heart gave out. He had no patience for the chain or the posture or any of it. He put the leader down in a single movement, clean, unhurried, using the boy's own weight against him. The second one hesitated, which was a mistake. The third ran. Under a minute total. He brushed sand off his knees and kept walking. His body had remembered before his mind finished deciding. Young muscles, the same old instincts. He noted it and moved on. 2 voices from behind him, familiar even across 30 years. He turned. Mongu had barely changed from the boy Moo-yuk knew at this age. Broad frame, a mouth permanently on the edge of speaking, an expression of someone who had been surprised by something and found it pleasant. Hyun-sung stood next to him, thinner, quieter, carrying the specific seriousness of a boy who trained harder than everyone around him and laughed less often. Both of them were staring at the 3 boys on the ground and then at Moo-yuk, working through several emotions in sequence. Mongu produced a sentence that was mostly disbelief. Hyun-sung asked, more practically, whether Moo-yuk was hurt. Moo-yuk looked at them, at the 17-year-old versions of the 2 people he had known since childhood, who had grown up and gotten older and built their lives while he spent his serving a family that used him. And something settled in his chest that was heavier than gladness. He told them he was fine. He told them he had missed them. They found this strange. Hyun-sung frowned. Mongu accepted it with the mild uncertainty he applied to most things that didn't make immediate sense, and asked no follow-up questions. Moo-yuk started walking toward the road, and they fell in beside him, because Mongu and Hyun-sung had always followed. That was the thing about good people. They showed up without needing a full explanation. He reached his grandmother's house by early afternoon. The garden was worse than he remembered, the beds unweeded, the old tree by the gate listing. She had been too tired to manage it lately, and a 17-year-old in his first life had not thought to notice. He noticed now, and it pulled at something. The gate squeaked on its hinges when he pushed through. He had never fixed that gate. He stood at the door. In the life that had just ended, he had taken 30 years to understand what she had given him. After his parents died, she was the only one who raised him, gave him stubbornness as an example, and warmth without conditions, and treated him as a person worth respecting when the Hyon family made it clear they considered him a utility. He had repaid her by spending decades running errands for people who looked down on him, right up until the night they put his car into the water. His eyes were already stinging before she opened the door. He wiped his face quickly, stood straight, and knocked. She came in her house slippers, green, old at the heel, the pair she had owned as long as he could remember. Her face when she saw him was simply her face, the ordinary expression of a grandmother who had been expecting him for lunch and had not expected anything difficult. She asked if he had eaten. He said no. She turned toward the kitchen and told him to come in. He sat at the table where he had done his homework as a child and watched her move and thought. 6 weeks. The signs had been there in the life he had already lived. The headaches she described as a pressure behind the eyes, the way she tired in the afternoon after small tasks. The doctor who had examined her and said it was tension. That doctor had been wrong. He had stood at her grave and understood the distance between caught early and too late, and spent 30 years never quite leaving that distance behind. He was not going to leave her in it again. Getting her to a different specialist took 3 evenings. She was not a woman who went to doctors readily. In her understanding of the world, problems either resolved or required stubbornness, and she applied this logic to her own body the same way she applied it to everything else. He worked on the problem the way he had once worked on reluctant debtors, patiently, from multiple angles, without obvious pressure. He mentioned a neighbor's wife with similar symptoms. He mentioned a classmate whose mother had been told the same thing and found it simple to fix once someone looked properly. He made the appointment himself and told her it was already arranged and only needed her presence. She went. The specialist found the arterial blockage her regular doctor had described as nothing serious. The procedure was minor and scheduled within the week. Routine, the doctor said, when caught at this stage. Muyuk sat in the hospital corridor the morning of the surgery with his palms flat on his knees. The lights hummed at a frequency he would not normally have noticed. An older man to his left turned magazine pages without reading them. A nurse passed twice without looking at anyone. When the doctor came through the door and said it had gone well, Muyuk pressed his hands together and looked at the floor and took a breath that felt like releasing something he had held for 30 years. She was going to live. The one person in the life before this who had asked nothing of him and given something instead. He was not going to waste it. The grandfather was the next problem, and the grandfather required strategy. Chairman Cheon Tyeson had built the Cheon loan empire from a single counter into a network with 4 senior district bosses, the kings of Myeongdong, as people called them, though not where the chairman could hear, who operated under his direction across the city. He was not a soft man. He had a face made of old decisions and the habit of evaluating everything, including people, as a potential transaction. Muyuk had worked under him for 15 years in his previous life before he stopped being afraid of the man. That fear had taken 15 years because the chairman had earned it. He was not afraid now. He knew exactly how the man thought. What Muyuk needed was access. The Cheon name opened doors that a 17-year-old with no credentials and no backing could not reach, and the moves he planned for the next 5 years required a foundation he could not build alone. The grandfather's empire was a tool. The challenge was getting inside it. He called the chairman's household and left a message. He did not ask for a meeting. What he said, calmly and clearly, was this. If the chairman wanted to speak with his grandson, the chairman would first visit the grave of Muyuk's mother. Then they could talk. The household assistant went quiet for a moment before saying the message would be passed along. Muyuk put the phone down. He knew what he was doing. In 30 years of working for the Cheon family, the grandfather had never visited that grave. Not once. The mother's death had been treated as a grief the family had processed by deciding not to think about it. A door everyone agreed to leave closed. There was guilt behind that door. Muyuk was using the guilt as a crowbar. 2 days later, the household called back. The chairman would pay his respects at the grave on Saturday morning. Would his grandson be available to meet that afternoon? Muyuk said yes. He arrived at the cemetery first and kept his distance while the chairman stood at the grave. The old man came alone. He set flowers down with the careful awkwardness of someone performing a gesture they had not practiced, and he stood there longer than any transaction required. His shoulders did something under his jacket that he would never have allowed in front of an audience. Whatever Cheon Tyeson was to the district bosses who feared him and the debtors who dreaded his name, at a grave in the morning light he was simply a man who had avoided something too long. At the tea house afterward, the chairman studied Muyuk across the table the way he studied everything, looking for the angle, the tell, the catch hidden inside the offer. He asked what the boy wanted. Muyuk told him, recognition, not sentiment, access. He was the person in this family who was actually going to hold it together, and he wanted a seat at the table to prove it. The chairman's fingers stilled against his cup. Muyuk laid out the bet. If he gained admission to Korea University, the most selective school in the country, less than 1% acceptance, the chairman would give him real standing in the family operation. Actual access, not allowance money. If he failed, the forfeit would be everything. Body and soul, as the old saying went. Whatever the chairman asked, for as long as he asked it. The chairman looked at this teenager across the table and agreed. He saw, probably, a combination of arrogance and ignorance, a boy who did not understand what he was promising. What was actually across the table was a man who had sat a version of this exam 30 years earlier, who knew its structure, its question patterns, its scoring, and exactly what margin would leave an impression that could not be dismissed. The bet was already won. What mattered now was how wide the margin was. He studied the way a craftsman works when the outcome is already decided, but the quality is still his responsibility. Library before it opened, library after the staff asked him to leave. He moved through the material with a steadiness that unsettled his classmates, who had been prepared for a troublemaker and received instead something they had no category for. A person who worked with the calm efficiency of someone who had already done this, and was only doing it again to satisfy a formality. His memory reached back to these subjects like rooms reopened after years, a little dusty, a little displaced, but entirely familiar once the light was on. There was a teacher who made the process inconvenient. He taught mathematics by tone, by which students he acknowledged and which he corrected in public. He protected his chosen few and penalized the others with a precision that suggested practice. Muyuk had met the type many times across a long career, in many different uniforms. One morning, the teacher made an example of a girl near the back of the classroom. A wrong answer delivered with the specific language of someone who had decided not to expect better. The room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when everyone is calculating where the next blow will land. Muyuk raised his hand. He proposed a public retest, in the reasonable tone he had once used with debtors who needed to understand how things were going to go. The teacher would set the questions. The entire class would sit it together. If the results were consistent with the teacher's recorded grades, Muyuk would apologize to the class for wasting their time. If they were not, the teacher could explain the gap himself. The teacher accepted, because refusing would have been its own answer. 3 days later, Muyuk scored highest. Several of the protected favorites placed well below the grades their records showed. The inconsistency was not subtle. The teacher submitted his resignation before the month ended. Muyuk did not make a speech about it. He walked past the girl near the back on his way out and told her, briefly, that her original answer had been correct. The teacher had been working from the wrong key. She stared at him. He went back to his notebook. He sat the Korea University entrance examination in December, in a hall of 200 people, and finished 40 minutes before time was called. He did not review his work. He spent the remaining time thinking about the 4 district bosses of Myeongdong, the senior men who ran the loan operation under his grandfather, and what he knew about each of them from his previous life. The results arrived in the new year. Perfect score. According to the testing center's records, no one had achieved it before. The chairman received the news by phone. Muyuk was told later, through the household, that the old man had sat in silence for a long time after the call without reaching for anything. He was invited to dinner. He met the family. His uncles were at the table. Suman, who was polished and controlled, dressed in the way expensive clothing makes men look, watching Muyuk across the room, with a steadiness that was too measured to be curiosity, and Suhan, who smiled more and talked more, and said less than either his smile or his talking suggested. Muyuk ate his food and watched both of them and kept his face correct. He knew what they were. He knew what they had done to him, in the life that had ended in black water, and he knew. He was nearly certain, not entirely certain yet, that what they had done to him was not the full extent of what they had done. There was something else, something buried deeper than his own murder, and it waited somewhere in the years ahead of him like a locked room he had not yet reached. In this life, his uncles saw only a grandson their father had suddenly decided to take seriously. That threatened them in the way any rearrangement of inheritance threatens the people who had been counting on the existing arrangement. Suman's control was the control of a man who had already decided to watch carefully. Suhan had not yet decided to be alarmed. They would both reconsider, in time. His cousin Jiwon was also at the table, the assumed heir, accustomed to being the obvious choice for long enough that he had mistaken a default for a birthright. He looked at Muyuk with the particular contempt reserved for people who appear somewhere without being invited. Muyuk gave him a brief, pleasant smile and looked away. He would get to Jiwon. Not tonight. After the meal, the grandfather pulled him aside. He confirmed what had been wagered. A genuine stake in Dahune, the conglomerate at the center of the family holdings. Not a controlling share, but real. A foothold. Muyuk thanked him in the correct way and did not say what he was actually thinking about. The shares were the smallest piece of what he needed. What he needed was the conversation coming next, about the 4 district bosses and the hidden accounts they had been quietly draining from his grandfather's empire for years. The chairman did not know about that. He had been a loyal man for decades, those bosses, and the chairman had trusted them the way any man trusts someone who has never yet given him a reason not to. Muyuk had spent years watching how trust became a blind spot. He had all the patience in the world. He had already lived the wrong version of this life once. He was not in a hurry to make the same mistakes again. He was, for the first time in his memory, exactly where he needed to be. And the uncles across the room had not the first idea what they had sitting at their father's table. Cousin Jiwon made his first mistake 3 weeks after that dinner. He was not a careful person. He had grown up being the obvious heir and had developed the habits of someone who had never needed to think ahead. A man who solved problems by leaning on the weight his family name carried, which had worked well enough in every situation he had encountered so far. He had not yet encountered a situation that required something else. He came to Muyuk with a folder. Inside were photographs. Not of anything criminal, of a classmate of Muyuk's. A girl he had tutored briefly, caught in a situation that looked worse than it was. Jiwon explained, pleasantly, that he thought his grandfather should not be distracted from business by rumors about the kind of people his new favorite grandson associated with. Unless, of course, some accommodation could be reached. Muyuk looked at the folder. He looked at Jiwon. He had negotiated with people who owed money they could not repay. He had dealt with men who had weapons and fewer options than they thought. He had handled situations that polished, well-dressed young men from money-lending families would not have survived for 10 minutes. Jiwon, watching him for a reaction, read the calm on Muyuk's face as uncertainty. That was the second mistake. Muyuk took the folder and said he would think about what Jiwon had said. Jiwon left satisfied. 2 days later, the same folder sat on the chairman's desk, along with a second folder that Muyuk had assembled, which contained a detailed account of how the photographs had been taken, who had arranged it, and what Jiwon had said when he presented them. It also contained 3 separate documented instances of Jiwon using the family name to run up debts he had no intention of settling, and 1 instance involving a business partner's daughter that was significantly more damaging than anything in the original folder. The chairman read both folders without speaking. Jiwon was summoned the next morning. Whatever was said in that room, Jiwon emerged from it a different color than he had entered, and did not look at Muyuk directly for the rest of the month. He had expected to find a cornered teenager, and had found something much older looking back at him through 17-year-old eyes. He did not learn from it. People like Jiwon rarely did. He came back a second time, months later, with friends and a different approach. Louder, more public, a scene at a nightclub near the university, designed to humiliate rather than threaten. Muyuk let it play out for a few minutes, long enough for a few of Jiwon's friends to commit themselves to the performance, and then handled it with the same efficiency he brought to everything. He did not raise his voice. He simply said, clearly and in front of Jiwon's friends, what would happen next if Jiwon wanted to continue this. Specifically what? In specific order, Jiwon's friends found other places to look. Jiwon went quiet in the way someone goes quiet when they have finally understood that they have been playing a game against someone who wrote the rules. The second humiliation landed harder than the first because it had an audience. Muyuk thought about Jiwon afterward for a while. Not with contempt, Jiwon was what the Chaeon family had made him, given unlimited access to a name he hadn't earned and zero consequences for the 30 years prior. In different circumstances, Muyuk might have felt sorry for him. In these circumstances, Jiwon was in his way, and the calculus was simpler than pity. The problem with the school called itself Jinpyo. He was the son of Cha Bong-soo, a chief prosecutor, which in a city where that name opened every door that money could not, made Jinpyo a young man who had grown up understanding that consequences were something that happened to other people. He ran a small operation at school, the kind of petty authority that thrives on fear rather than respect, and for the most part he was simply an inconvenience Muyuk filed away and ignored. Then Jinpyo took one of Muyuk's friends. Specifically, he took Minkyung, a girl in the study group Muyuk had assembled, brilliant and poor, whom he had been funding through the semester because he knew what she would become in the years ahead, and because she had done nothing wrong except have less money than she deserved. Jinpyo pulled her aside after class one afternoon with two of his people, into a car, into a situation with no good ending visible from the outside. Muyuk found out within the hour. He went directly to where Jinpyo had taken her. He did not call anyone first. He did not make a plan that required more time than he had. He went, and when he arrived, he was not quiet about the process of making the situation stop. Minkyung got out. Jinpyo's two people required more persuading than Jinpyo himself, who turned out to be significantly less willing to absorb consequences than he had been willing to distribute them. Muyuk left the scene intact. Minkyung unharmed, situation resolved. No lasting damage except to Jinpyo's self-assessment. He thought that would be the end of it. He underestimated what it meant to embarrass a prosecutor's son. Cha Bong-soo had Muyuk brought in the next morning under a pretext that had nothing to do with Jinpyo and everything to do with the expression on his son's face the night before. The room they put him in was not a formal interrogation room. The men in it were not there for a formal process. What happened in that room over the next several hours was the kind of correction a man like Cha Bong-soo delivered when he wanted a lesson to stick. Painful, methodical, and carried out by people who were accustomed to the work. Muyuk sat through it with the specific stillness of a person who has already absorbed worse and knows that displaying pain only extends the session. He did not tell them what they wanted. He did not beg. He waited. He had one card. He had been waiting for the right moment to play it. He asked, when they paused, whether Chief Prosecutor Cha was aware of whose grandson he currently had in a chair. The room went still in a different way than it had been still before. He gave them the name, Chaeon Taeson. He said it simply, without emphasis, the way you say something that does not require assistance from your tone, because the words carry everything themselves. One of the men left the room. He was gone for 4 minutes. When he came back, his face had reorganized itself into an entirely new arrangement. Chief Prosecutor Cha appeared shortly after that, not in the room, in the hallway outside it, where Muyuk could hear a phone call being conducted in the careful voice of a man rapidly reassessing a series of decisions he had made over the past 18 hours. The chairman's household had apparently not needed much time to make the relevant facts understood. The apology, when it came, was thorough. It was also meaningless to Muyuk, who noted it the way you note weather, accurate data about the current conditions, nothing more. He filed Cha Bong-soo away for later. Jinpyo was expelled from school within the week. The official reason involved conduct unbecoming, which was a polite summary. Minkyung returned to the study group the following Monday and did not discuss what had happened, which Muyuk respected. She was the kind of person who processed things privately and moved forward, and she did not need him to make the incident into a narrative. He continued funding her coursework. He continued meeting with the study group. He understood what the friendships he was building now were worth in 10 years, when the people in that room would be prosecutors and judges and politicians, and a man who had helped them when they had nothing would be in an entirely different position than someone who had simply known them. It was around this time that he found Park Dong-soo. He did not go looking for him exactly. Dong-soo found him the way certain people find each other, through a series of circumstances that looked accidental from the outside and were not, quite, on closer inspection. Dong-soo was running a small crew of delinquents near the edges of a district the grandfather's bosses controlled, the kind of operation that lived in the spaces between legitimate authority and organized crime. Not large enough to threaten anyone, not small enough to be ignored forever. Muyuk knew what happened to Park Dong-soo in the original timeline. He got involved with the wrong organization, built something real, and then the government's crackdown on crime in the early 90s swept him away with everything else that hadn't built strong enough roots. He died badly and young, and for no reason except that no one had positioned him correctly before the wave came. Muyuk found him at a noodle shop near the university, eating alone, counting money he had collected that morning, with the focused expression of someone who was managing more than they should be managing by themselves. He sat down across from him without being invited. Dong-soo looked up with the expression people wore when they expected trouble. Then he looked more carefully at Muyuk, at something in the way Muyuk occupied the chair, the absence of the usual social signaling that people the same age as Dong-soo relied on, and the expression shifted to something more uncertain. Muyuk told him, directly and without preamble, that he was going to help him. Not as a favor. As a business arrangement, he told him what was coming. A government campaign against street-level crime that would hit within the next year, targeting exactly the kind of operation Dong-soo was running, and that the organizations with strong ties to established hierarchies would survive it, and the ones without would not. He told him that surviving it would require positioning he could not get alone, and that he was offering the positioning. Dong-soo stared at him for a long moment. He asked how Muyuk knew about the crackdown. Muyuk told him he read the right newspapers and paid attention to what politicians said when they thought no one was listening. Which was true in both directions. The foreknowledge was real, and it happened to be the kind that looked like pattern recognition if you described it the right way. Dong-soo had the instincts of someone who had survived by correctly reading which situations were genuine and which were traps. He studied Muyuk across the table for another 30 seconds. Then he ordered more noodles and said he was listening. What followed was a working relationship that would eventually look, to people who watched from the outside, like a natural alliance between a rising businessman and an up-and-coming criminal organizer. From the inside, it was something more specific, a man with 30 years of foresight building the enforcement infrastructure he would need for the plans ahead, using someone who was talented and loyal and would otherwise have been wasted. Muyuk helped Dong-soo reposition his operation, away from the exposed street-level work and toward the kind of subcontracted activity that had enough institutional distance to survive a government sweep. When the crackdown came, Dong-soo's crew was already 2 steps removed from the obvious targets. They watched other operations disintegrate around them and emerged intact. Dong-soo, after that, was not uncertain about where his loyalty sat. The 4 district bosses of Myeongdong were a subtler problem. They had served his grandfather for over a decade, men named Ho-shik, Yong-tae, Bong-chun, and a 4th that the district called Old Park, though that was not his name. They controlled the loan operations in their respective territories, collected the payments, managed the enforcement, and submitted their accounting to the chairman each quarter. The chairman trusted them because they had never given him a concrete reason not to. Muyuk knew what the accounting concealed. He had learned it in his previous life. Not from documents, but from a drunken conversation one evening with a low-level collector who did not know who Muyuk actually was, or that what he was describing with such careless bitterness would eventually reach the chairman's ears. The 4 bosses had been running a second set of books for years, not dramatically, not in a way that would have drawn attention in any single quarter. Slowly, carefully, in small consistent amounts that accumulated over time into a sum that would have made the chairman's face do something unpleasant if he had known about it. He had never known about it, in the first life. Muyuk began with Ho-shik, because Ho-shik was the most exposed and the least careful. He had the man's collector followed for 3 days, which told him which numbers were real and which were construction. He had the same done for Yong-tae, which took longer because Yong-tae was more methodical. By the time he had what he needed on all 4, he had a picture of approximately 8 years of accumulated discrepancy that was large enough to be described as extraordinary. He requested a meeting with all 4 bosses together. They came, because he was the chairman's recognized grandson now, with shares in Dahoon and a standing in the family that had arrived faster than anyone had expected. They came with the careful respect of men who had not yet decided how seriously to take him. He sat down at the head of the table. He laid out, in plain and specific terms, what he knew: the amounts, the accounts, the particular methods each of them had used to make the numbers plausible. He did not raise his voice. He did not threaten them in the explicit language of threat. He simply explained what was in front of them and let the explanation finish itself. The room was quiet for a moment. Hoshik tried the obvious move first, called it a misunderstanding, suggested the accounts could be reviewed, proposed that errors in the bookkeeping had been made in good faith. Muyuk listened to the entire argument without expression and then told him, specifically and without warmth, which account held the discrepancy from March of 1987, and the name of the man who had processed the adjustment, and the amount to the 10,000 won. Hoshik stopped talking. Muyuk told them what the terms were. The full amount returned to the chairman's accounts, all of it, across all 4 operations, within 60 days. A restructured arrangement going forward under closer accounting. Their positions maintained if the 60 days were met without complication. 3 of the 4 accepted this. Bongchun argued, not the amounts, not the accounting, but the principle. He said the arrangement they had maintained had been understood to include certain informal compensations, that the chairman knew the shape of these things even if he did not know the specifics, that this was simply how business had been done for a decade. He was mid-sentence when Muyuk nodded to the man standing at the back of the room. What happened to Bongchun's hand in the next 30 seconds was a precise and practical demonstration that informal compensations had a new ceiling, and that ceiling had not been set by people who were willing to argue about it. Bongchun left the meeting able to continue his work but not, for some time afterward, with full use of his right hand. The other 3 watched this and became very cooperative. The 60 days were met. Every yen of the discrepancy returned. The accounting reports that followed were accurate in ways the previous decades had not been, because all 4 bosses now understood that the person reviewing them had already seen the original numbers and would notice if the new ones required explaining. The chairman was not told the full details of what had been recovered, only that Muyuk had identified and rectified inefficiencies in the district accounting, which was accurate in the way that descriptions sometimes are when they contain true things arranged to minimize context. What the chairman understood was that his grandson had walked into a room with 4 senior men who had operated with substantial autonomy for a decade, and had walked out with the situation reorganized. He sent Muyuk a bottle of something expensive and a handwritten note that said he was beginning to understand what the boy was. Muyuk read the note twice and put it in a drawer. He was building something, not just recovering what had been taken. The bosses were now tools he could use. Dong-su was an infrastructure asset. The study group was a network of future influence. The Dahoon shares were a foundation. And somewhere above all of this, his uncle sat in the family structure not yet understanding that the inheritance they had killed him to protect was being reorganized from beneath them, one quiet move at a time. They had no idea what they were looking at when they looked at him. He intended to let them keep not knowing for a while longer. The man Muyuk needed was called Han Kyung-young, and Han Kyung-young was currently in a parking structure near Ye-gyoido, with 3 men standing over him who had not come to discuss the stock market. Muyuk had spent 2 weeks confirming the shape of his situation before going near it. Kyung-young had once been an analyst who read market movements with a precision his colleagues described as uncanny, not because of connections or leaks, but because he understood patterns that others were still looking at as noise. He had taken positions in his own account, every one correctly called, and the regulatory system, unable to distinguish that kind of intelligence from insider trading, had stripped his license, his savings, and eventually his remaining options. The 3 men in the parking structure were the last link in that chain. Muyuk arrived before they finished. He handled the situation without announcing himself or explaining the reasoning behind his presence. The 3 men were organized poorly, which meant the whole thing was brief. Kyung-young watched from the ground, with the expression of someone who has been having a very bad several months and is no longer confident about the structure of events. Muyuk offered him a hand up. He gave his name. He said he had a proposal. Kyung-young, dusting concrete from his jacket with what remained of his composure, asked why he should trust a stranger who had appeared from nowhere to assault his creditors. Muyuk told him the Kospi would drop 3% by Thursday on a rate announcement from the Bank of Korea that most analysts had not yet priced in. He said it the way someone mentions the weather, not to impress, just because it was accurate. Thursday came. The announcement came with it. The market moved exactly as stated. Kyung-young called the number he had been given on Friday morning, and the conversation that followed was short and efficient, because both of them were the kind of people who did not need to talk around the point once the point was clear. What they built together operated through an American registration, Dream High Investments, incorporated in California, structured so that Muyuk's involvement was invisible to anyone reading the paperwork at a surface level. Kyung-young held the licenses and presented the public face. Muyuk directed the positions. Between them, they began moving money in ways that looked, from outside, like aggressive but informed speculation. From inside, it was simpler than that. A man who already knew what was going to happen was positioning himself before it did. The real name financial reform had been on Muyuk's calendar since 1990. The policy would require all accounts to be held under verifiable identities rather than pseudonyms, designed to close the channels through which large sums moved invisibly. The people most exposed were exactly the kind of people who ran the kind of operation his grandfather ran. Money held in accounts that were legally theirs but practically anonymous, built up over decades of business that had operated in the space between legitimate finance and something harder to describe. He moved 400 billion won of the chairman's hidden funds to American accounts 6 months before the announcement. He told the grandfather only that a policy change was coming, that a contact in the banking sector had indicated the direction, and that the safe position was to move first. He did not explain the source of the intelligence more precisely than that. The chairman had not survived 40 years in money lending by trusting sentiment over concrete information. He authorized the transfers. When the announcement arrived, money moved across the country in a week. Visible, taxable, complicated. What Muyuk had already moved sat in California, clean and growing under Kyung-young's management. The 400 billion was the foundation, the rest he built on top of it. Netscape was the first major position through Dream High, a browser company that most Korean investors had not encountered yet, in a market where consumer internet was still years from reaching ordinary households. Kyung-young winced at the purchase price and asked whether they were certain. Muyuk told him they were certain. Kyung-young, who had by then watched 4 predictions arrive with an accuracy that suggested either extraordinary research or something he preferred not to examine too closely, processed his concern and executed the order. The Steve Jobs meeting took longer to arrange. Jobs was at Next at that point, managing both it and his Pixar investment, years from returning to Apple, carrying the particular energy of someone who had not yet been proven right again and knew it. The reputation around him was complicated. Genuine reverence from some, a cautious distance from others, watching for signs of whether this was a second chapter or a long decline. Muyuk sat across from him in a room in Cupertino and did not perform either the reverence or the caution. He made a specific offer, a 50-50 capital stake in a vehicle holding positions in both Next and Pixar, structured so that Jobs kept complete operational control of both. No board involvement, no interference in decisions, pure capital, with a long-term horizon. Jobs looked at him for a while. He asked what Muyuk actually expected in return. Muyuk said, long-term returns, and the relationship. He said it simply, without the flattery that Jobs had clearly built a calibrated immunity to over years of people managing him in one direction or another. The negotiation took several hours. The terms Kyung-young eventually read in the agreement made him describe it, quietly, as the most unusual deal structure he had encountered in 20 years of financial work. But Jobs signed it. Muyuk thought what had moved him was not the capital or the structure. Everyone who came to Jobs at this stage of his career was either handling him carefully out of pity or watching for the moment the decline became undeniable. Muyuk had talked to him the way you talk to someone whose return is not a question of whether but of when. Which, of course, it was not. Muyuk knew exactly when, and precisely what it would be worth. Hyun-sung had been training for judo since he was 9. Not the way talented people train when they enjoy something. The way someone trains when they have looked at their life and decided that this is the center of it, and everything else exists in relation to it. Nationally ranked at 17, at 18, he was being discussed as a serious prospect for the next Olympic cycle. He trained before school and after and on weekends, and the only time the seriousness in him eased into something lighter was when he talked about the upcoming national tournament, which he did with the careful understatement of someone who wanted a thing very much and had not yet let himself be sure of it. Muyuk had heard him describe the tournament 3 times from 3 different angles. The bracket, his weight class, the opponents he had studied on film. Each time he had listened while appearing to be only half paying attention, because listening fully would have required acknowledging something that complicated the discipline he had built around himself for 30 years. He was not running that discipline the same way this time. The car hit Hyunsung on a Tuesday morning, 6 weeks before the tournament. It mounted the pavement from behind at a speed and angle that removed accident from consideration, struck him on the training path he ran every morning at the same hour, and was gone before anyone nearby had processed what they had seen. Hyunsung was in surgery for 3 hours. The knee damage, the surgeon said afterward, was significant, potentially permanent in its effect on high-level competition. He would walk without difficulty. He would not compete at the level he had spent 9 years building toward. Muyuk was at the hospital when the surgeon came through the door. He stood in the corridor for a moment, then he walked to the stairwell at the end of the ward and sat on the steps and stayed there for a while, alone, doing nothing in particular. He had spent his first life absorbing losses with the practicality of someone who had decided grief was an inefficiency. He was not doing that now. He sat in the stairwell and felt the full weight of what had been taken from someone who had not done a single thing to deserve it, and gave that weight its proper time. When he came back to the ward, his face was steady. Hyunsung was awake, looking at the ceiling with the expression of someone still organizing new information into what it meant for the rest of their life. Muyuk sat beside him and said nothing for a while. Then he said, quietly, that whoever had done this was going to regret it. Hyunsung told him to leave it alone. Muyuk did not argue. He also did not leave it alone. He found the car in 6 days. It had been cleaned and was sitting in a lot belonging to a construction company called Polar Constructions, registered to a man named Jo Hyung-gu. The registration connected to a subsidiary. The subsidiary connected to a driver paid from a company account. The payment connected to an authorization signed 2 levels below Jo Hyung-gu, but drawn on a discretionary fund only Jo Hyung-gu controlled. The chain was not short. It was complete. Jo Hyung-gu was a construction magnate with contracts across 3 districts and the civic presence that comes from donating visibly to institutions that name rooms after you. He had a son who competed in judo. The son was scheduled to face Hyunsung in the tournament's quarterfinal bracket and had been expected, by anyone who had watched both of them compete, to lose. Muyuk sat with this for a night. A man had ordered a car driven into his friend's back on a training path to protect his son from losing a youth tournament. Not a professional circuit, a national youth competition. He had arranged permanent physical damage to an 18-year-old boy for that. He spent the night very still about it. In the morning he began making calls. What came for Jo Hyung-gu arrived in 3 stages, because Muyuk had learned long ago that a single blow was less effective than the architecture of several. The first stage concerned the son. No violence, something more precise. The chain of documentation connecting the hit-and-run authorization to Polar Constructions, combined with a detailed review of the son's competitive record, reached the National Judo Federation's Oversight Committee as an anonymous query. The committee's own inquiry found irregularities in the son's competitive history that bore examination. The son was suspended pending review. He did not compete again, not from physical injury, but the symmetry was not accidental. Jo Hyung-gu noticed the inquiry. He likely suspected a connection. He did not yet understand the scale of what had noticed him. The second stage was the company itself. Polar Constructions held 3 active government contracts. Dong-soo, through 4 months of patient work across the subcontractor relationships he had spent 2 years building, produced situations in which 2 of those 3 contracts became subject to disputes Polar could not easily navigate. One dispute involved materials documentation. Another involved a labor code review conducted by an inspector whose diligence on this particular case was, for reasons unrelated to anything, exceptional. A lender reviewed Polar's favorable terms and found reasons to be less favorable. A joint venture partner reconsidered. By the time the 3rd stage arrived, Polar was a different company than it had been. Jo Hyung-gu was dealing with individual problems too fast to see the structure connecting them. The third stage was the arrest. The documentation that reached the prosecutor's office was thorough. Not only the hit and run, Muyuk had spent those 4 months compiling a wider picture of how Jo Hyung-gu ran his affairs, and that picture showed a man who had been conducting himself with the certainty of someone who believed consequences were distributed to other people. The tax irregularities were substantial. The contract-related payments were more so. The hit-and-run evidence was simply the cleanest piece of the package. Jo Hyung-gu was arrested on a Thursday, outside his office, in front of 3 of his employees. The charge list was long. He was convicted. In the detention center where he was held during the proceedings, he encountered a situation one evening that he had not anticipated, one that left him with a more complete understanding of what he had set in motion on a Tuesday morning 6 weeks before a judo tournament. The understanding arrived late and, for Muyuk's purposes, was sufficient. Hyun-sung was told, months after the arrest, that the investigation had reached a conclusion. He did not ask what that meant in detail. He sat with it for a moment, and then asked how Muyuk's semester was going. Muyuk said it was fine. They did not discuss Jo Hyung-gu again. Mink-young came to him near the end of that semester, after the others had cleared out of their usual study room, and said something she had clearly been deciding whether to say for some time. She was precise about it, because she was precise about everything. It was one of the qualities that made her exceptional as a student and would make her formidable in the years ahead when she had the credentials to match the mind. She told him she had feelings for him, directly, without the circling such conversations often required. Then she waited. He listened to all of it. He was quiet for a moment. He told her the gratitude he felt was genuine, not the condescending kind that this sort of conversation sometimes produces. He told her she was someone he actually respected, which was different from his relationship with most people, and which she deserved to hear plainly. And then he was honest. He could not be what she was describing. Not because of her. Because of everything he was carrying. The plans, the weight of what he was building, and who he was building against. And he could not hold all of that and a relationship at the same time, without the relationship becoming unfair to whoever was in it. She considered this for a moment. Then she said she understood, and she meant it. She returned to the study group the following week. The dynamic adjusted slightly, the way it adjusts when something honest has been said between people, and then settled into something that was, if anything, warmer than it had been. Honesty produces that, when both people handle it well. He continued funding her coursework. She continued being the sharpest person in every room they shared. Neither of them returned to the conversation. He thought about it occasionally, in the way he thought about most of the trades his life required. Not with regret. With the clear-eyed awareness of someone who understood what they were setting aside, and had set it aside deliberately. The plans he was running required everything. They had required everything in his first life too, and left him in the end with nothing but a car filling with seawater. This time the sacrifice was at least his own to make. That was different. That meant something. And what he was building, slowly, carefully, across family and finance, and the network of people who would matter in a decade, was becoming something real. The grandfather's empire was partially his now. The financial infrastructure was growing beyond anything the family could see or measure. The men who had killed him in one life were sitting in their positions unaware. He was not finished, not even close. But somewhere in the city, without his knowing it yet, a chain of evidence was about to surface that would change what he thought he was doing this for. The chain began with a photograph. Not a dramatic one, a faded print from 1979, found inside a folder that Dong-su's people had recovered while clearing the personal effects of one of the Myeongdong bosses who had been quietly removed from his position after the accounting dispute. The boss had kept certain documents that should not have been kept, for reasons people in that profession keep such things. Insurance, leverage, the comfort of knowing something that others wanted buried. The photograph showed his mother. She was young in it, early 30s, standing outside a building Muyuk recognized as a subsidiary office of a company that no longer existed under that name. Beside her stood a man he did not recognize, and beside that man stood someone he did. The third figure in the photograph was a younger version of his uncle Suman, in a suit that placed the image in the mid-1970s, with an expression that was not the expression of someone meeting a woman at a business function. It was the expression of someone conducting a transaction. Muyuk sat with the photograph for a long time. His mother had not died of the traffic accident everyone in the family described. He had always understood this at some level, the way the subject was avoided, the specific texture of his grandfather's silence on the matter, the manner in which the uncles deflected when it came up. But understanding at a level and knowing it as a fact were different things. He had spent 30 years filing the first undergrief and leaving the second untouched. He pulled on the thread. It took 4 months, not because the evidence was buried deeply, but because he moved carefully, building the picture completely before touching any of it, the way you approach something that will not hold still if you startle it. He used sources Dong-Soo had access to, connections through the study group's network of future prosecutors who owed him favors they did not yet know they would repay, and 2 individuals inside the chairman's financial infrastructure who understood that cooperating with the grandson was the kind of cooperation that paid forward. What he found was this. His mother had been the chairman's daughter from a relationship before his formal marriages, legitimate by every accounting that mattered. A recognized heir with a genuine claim to a portion of the Kaon inheritance. She had not been passive about that claim. In the years before her death, she had been organizing, quietly, through lawyers and paper structures, a position that would have made her a material obstacle to the uncle's eventual succession. Suman had known this. He had been watching her for years. The organization he had used to resolve the problem was called the Blue Wind Society. The name circulated in certain circles as something between a rumor and a known fact. An arrangement of powerful men, drawn from law and business and government, who operated as a kind of parallel governance behind the visible institutions. They did not advertise themselves. Their reach was significant enough that people who knew of them generally preferred not to discuss it in rooms where the walls might be thinner than they appeared. Suman had brought the problem of his mother to someone inside the society. The society had resolved it. In exchange, the Chaeon family's political and financial interests had become aligned with the society's in ways that were not written anywhere but functioned as reliably as written contracts. His mother had been killed to clear an inheritance line. The society had killed her because it was convenient to do a favor, and because aligning the Chaeon Empire with their interests was worth the cost of one woman who was in someone's way. He knew all of this by the middle of 1995. He sat in his apartment the night he finished compiling the last piece of the picture, with the documents laid out on the table in front of him, and did not move for a long time. He poured a drink. He did not drink it. He poured a second one, and drank that one too fast. Dong-Soo came by an hour later. He had a key, a practical arrangement born out of the number of situations that had required his presence at short notice, and found Muyuk at the table with the documents and the empty glass and a stillness that made Dong-Soo sit down without speaking. Muyuk told him what the documents showed, not quickly, carefully, because speaking it out loud was a different process than having assembled it in his own head. Dong-Soo listened through all of it. Then he asked what Muyuk wanted to do. Muyuk said he wanted a few more days. He was still deciding which order to pull things in. He cried at some point during those few days, alone, at a time he would not have predicted, not for himself, for the 30 years of his first life that he had spent serving the people responsible for it, not knowing. 30 years of carrying their water and solving their problems and making their empire run, believing his mother had died in an accident and his uncles were simply selfish rather than something worse. He grieved that version of himself briefly and completely. Then he folded it away and went to see Suhan. Uncle Suhan was in a minimum security facility, a consequence of financial irregularities that had surfaced 18 months earlier through a regulatory review that had not been entirely accidental. He had prison privileges that most inmates did not, because men of his background and the chairman's network generally did. He had a private visiting room. Muyuk sat across from him and put one document on the table between them. Suhan looked at the document. His face went through a sequence of expressions, starting with careful neutrality and ending somewhere past that. Muyuk asked him a single question. What had he known, and when had he known it? Suhan said nothing for almost a full minute. Then he said he had not known beforehand. He had learned after, from Suman, as a fact already accomplished. He said he had considered what to do about it and had concluded that there was nothing to be done, that the alternative to silence was a conflict with forces that neither of them could survive, and that the dead could not be returned by a living man making himself a target. Muyuk listened to the entire explanation. He did not interrupt it. He did not respond to it with the argument it invited. He told Suhan that he had heard him and that Suhan's cooperation going forward would be noted and would influence how certain information about him was managed over the coming years. He said this without warmth or cruelty, in the flat transactional tone of someone completing a step in a process. He picked the document up and left. The conversation with his grandfather was different, because his grandfather was different, a man who had made a lifetime of decisions and was now sitting with the accumulated weight of them in an old man's body, in a study full of artifacts of an empire that was changing shape around him whether he acknowledged it or not. Muyuk set the full file on the desk. The chairman looked at it for a long time without opening it. Then he opened it. He read slowly and completely, the way he read everything, as a man who has never trusted summaries because the thing that matters is usually in the detail. When he finished, he set the file down and looked at his desk. Muyuk let the silence run. The chairman said, eventually, that he had suspected the shape of it, not the society's direct involvement. That had been concealed well enough that confirming it had required what Muyuk had brought him, but the shape. He said he had suspected for years that his daughter's death had not been an accident and had chosen not to pursue the suspicion, because pursuing it would have required confronting his son, and confronting Suman would have required confronting what the Hyun family had bought its survival with. He said it in the voice of a man who was too old for dishonesty about himself. Muyuk looked at his grandfather, really looked at him, the way the first life's version of him had never quite managed. A man in his 70s, alone in a large study, who had built something significant out of nothing, and had paid for its continuation with the life of his own daughter, and 3 decades of pretending not to know. Not a monster. Something more ordinary and more terrible than a monster. A man who had made one catastrophic compromise and spent the rest of his life arranged around not examining it. He felt something that was not forgiveness and not contempt. Something in between, which did not have a clean name. He told the chairman what he needed. He needed Suman removed. Completely and visibly, stripped of his position in the family's holdings, separated from the Samsung-connected marriage the society had helped broker, sent far enough that his ability to coordinate with them was practically compromised. He named Australia, not because it was symbolic, but because the distance was real. He needed the ledger. He had known about the ledger for weeks. It was the chairman's private record of 40 years of interactions with the Blue Wind Society. Names, transactions, specific instances of their involvement in decisions across politics and business that would, in the right hands at the right moment, constitute a weapon of extraordinary usefulness. The chairman had kept it as protection, and had kept it secret, because the protection only functioned if the society did not know it existed. The chairman looked at him when he named the ledger. He was not surprised, exactly. He was confirming something. He told Muyuk the ledger existed. He said he would not hand it over now, not because he was protecting the society, but because Muyuk was not yet powerful enough for possession of it to be an asset rather than a liability. A man who holds a weapon he cannot yet use is simply a target. He said that when the day came that Muyuk could use it, he would hand it over without conditions. Muyuk accepted this. It was a reasonable position from a man who was still thinking strategically despite everything. The conversation with Suman came through the chairman and was brief. Suman was informed, in the particular language the chairman used when there was no negotiation available, of the terms. The Samsung marriage was dissolved. The mechanisms of that particular unraveling were handled by people who had done similar work before. The position in the family holdings was transferred. The flight to Melbourne was 6 weeks later. At the airport, Muyuk was not there, but was told, Suman had looked composed. The composure of someone who has accepted a temporary situation that he intends to rectify later. Muyuk knew what that composure meant. Suman had already made contact with the society. He had gone to them with his humiliation as currency, and they had received it as an investment. The society had decided, their language, passed through an intermediary who relayed it without understanding how it would be received, to wait. To let the bonsai grow a little more before pruning it. He understood what that meant. They were not afraid of him yet. They were simply patient, and had decided he would be more useful as a lesson when the time came, rather than a problem addressed too soon. They would reconsider that patience. He was going to give them specific reasons to reconsider it. Han Kyung-yong called him in December of 1994, with a voice that was working very hard to stay level. The Mexican peso position had been building for 14 months. A leveraged short against the currency, structured through 3 separate vehicles in the American market, based on Muyuk's specific knowledge of what would happen in the last days of 1994, when the Mexican government, out of reserves and out of options, allowed the peso to float. What that float would produce, the speed and magnitude of the devaluation, was not something the market had priced in. The market had been watching Mexico and deciding, collectively, that the signals were ambiguous. Muyuk had known for 30 years that the signals were not ambiguous. He had simply waited. Kyungyung's voice, that December, was level in the way a voice becomes level when the number behind it is too large to produce a normal emotional response. He told Muyuk the peso had devalued faster than even their model had projected. He told him the positions had closed at margins that exceeded the projection by a third. He said the number 3 times, because the first 2 times he was not sure he was saying it correctly. $25 billion. Not $1. Muyuk sat with the phone and listened to Kyungyung say the number 3 times, and did not respond immediately. He had known what the trade would yield. He had known since 1990, when he had first started positioning for it, that this was the move that would transform what he was building from large to unreachable. No family network, no inheritance dispute, no organizational pressure from people who did not understand what they were dealing with. None of it would matter past a certain threshold of financial mass. He had just crossed that threshold by a significant distance. He told Kyungyung he had done excellent work. He told him the bonus structure they had agreed on 3 years earlier would be honored in full. Kyungyung said something that was not quite words, caught himself, and said thank you. Muyuk put the phone down. He thought about his uncles. He thought about a parking structure near Yeouido, where he had found a broken man with a loan shark's fist in his collar, and had built, from that man, the financial architecture that had just produced this. He thought about his mother and the photograph, and the document on a prison visiting room table. He thought about Suman in Melbourne, in whatever apartment the settlement had produced, making calls to people in the society, and believing he was preparing a return. He thought about his grandmother, who was alive and healthy, and had called him last Sunday to say she had seen his friend Mongu at the market and told him to eat more. $25 billion. And the Asian financial crisis was still 3 years away. He was not finished. He was, in some real sense, only now beginning. The call from Cheoljiang came on a Tuesday evening in the early spring. He almost did not answer. The number was not one he had saved, and he had a standing habit of not picking up unknown numbers, because the categories of people who called unknown numbers at him were limited and mostly required specific mental preparation. But something about the timing, the hour, the particular vibration of an evening when the apartment was quiet, and he had been reading old notes about the society's structure, made him pick up. A young woman's voice. Thin in the way voices get when someone has been crying for long enough that the crying is finished and what remains is the aftermath. She said his name. Then she said she was Cheoljiang, Uncle Suhan's daughter, his cousin, whom he had met twice at family functions, and who had existed in his awareness as a peripheral figure in a family he was at war with. She said she wanted to meet him. She said she was sorry to call at this hour. She said, and here her voice did the thing that voices do when someone is trying very hard not to let what is actually happening show through, that she did not know who else to call. Muyuk sat forward. He asked her where she was. She told him. He told her to stay there. He was already standing when the call ended, reaching for his jacket with one hand and thinking through the implications with the other. Suhan's daughter. Suhan, who was in a facility with stripped privileges and a drinking habit that had developed in the 18 months since their conversation in the visiting room. Suhan, whose cooperation had been noted and whose situation Muyuk had not altered because altering it had not yet served a purpose. What purpose it might serve had just become significantly less abstract. He did not know yet what Cheoljiang was going to tell him. He did not know whether she was reaching out on her own behalf or in some capacity that involved her father or the broader entanglements of a family that had spent 30 years accumulating debts it could not pay. He did not know whether she was frightened or in danger or simply lost in the way people become lost when the adults in their lives have failed them comprehensively enough. He knew she had called him. He knew he was going. The ledger sat in a safe somewhere in his grandfather's study, waiting for a day that was getting closer. The society had decided to be patient, and patience was simply distance, and distance closed. $25 billion was not a ceiling. It was the beginning of a platform. And somewhere in an apartment he was now driving toward, a young woman who shared his blood was crying at an hour when most people were not calling anyone. He did not know what the next chapter looked like yet. He had known the first one before it happened, because he had lived it. This part, the part that came after everything he had prepared, where the preparations began to collide with a world that was also moving, also changing, also producing outcomes he had not foreseen. This part was genuinely new. He found he was not afraid of that. He found he was almost, for the first time in a second life defined by the weight of what he already knew, curious.